What I'd like to see, Canada become our 51st state.
Nearly a 300% tariff from Canada on American butter and American cheese.
I reject any attempts to weaken Canada.
The impact of this is probably the worst economic attack on our country that we have experienced in our lifetime.
They will still have to be business partners.
Canada will never be the 51st state.
We will not back down.
What a wild ride it's been as we count down to arguably the most consequential election of our time. Canadian niceness has worn off and people are irate. A lot of that anger stems from misinformation and lies circulating online. Well, tonight we take a closer look at the confusion and deception leading up to Canada's 45th election. What exactly is at stake in this dangerous digital age? Let's bring in Heidi Tworek, a UBC researcher with an eye on election disinfo. Heidi looks at the impact of new tech on democracy. We also have two journalists with us who have covered misinformation in this election. James Temperton is the managing editor of The Logic. He's in Montreal today. And Alex Boyd is a reporter with the Toronto Star, based in Calgary usually, but here with us in studio today. Great to have you all.
Thanks for having us.
Alex, let me start with you. You know, I covered the federal election in 2019 as a parliamentary reporter.
Right.
At that time, misinformation, disinformation was not front and center. Today, that's changed. In your mind, what is the biggest way that this topic is really shaping the election that maybe even voters don't know about?
I think when people think about misinformation, they think about a very specific example. They think about foreign interference. They think about very specific campaigns. They think of, a big bad, whether that's another country, whether that's a nefarious actor, trying to make us believe things that are incorrect. And sometimes that is an issue, and that is definitely something that we should be watching for. But I think that misses the broader, more corrosive effect, which is when it becomes increasingly hard to tell what's true online, when social media is increasingly unreliable, when you're looking online and everything's AI, there's a very strong impulse to just throw up your hands and say, you know what, I don't know what's true, I can't tell, I'm just going to step back. And when you want to live in a democracy where people are engaged in their community, engaged in the issues, that is a very, very damaging impact.
Right, we don't want that apathy. James, the Logic has covered this topic extensively. Was there a moment when you thought, the misinfo or disinfo was so pervasive in this cycle?
Yeah, there's this really alarming statistic. So all news is banned on meta platforms in Canada. So you can't see news on Facebook, you can't see news on Instagram. Despite that, and that being the case for a number of years now, 57% of Canadians think that they're getting news on Facebook, but they're not. So in this really, really consequential federal election, what are they getting if they think they're getting news?
Yeah.
And that's a really unique circumstance that Canada finds itself in this federal election. It's the first time that the most popular online platform for the consumption of news is completely devoid of news.
And we're going to get into that a little bit more with the Online News Act. I know you have a lot to say on that, James. Heidi, I want to ask, how does mis and disinfo specifically shape public opinion during an election?
So one point that I'd like to make underscores what Alex said, which is that the research shows us that one or two pieces of dis or misinformation almost certainly aren't going to be changing someone's vote. So that's less the problem that the researchers are worried about, and more about how this general information ecosystem is creating things like information voids. So for example, that 57% of people going on Facebook and thinking they're finding news, but actually there's no news, so they're seeing problematic content potentially or scams instead. And we're also worried about how this has long-term effects on people's trust in democracy and their trust in other individuals in that democracy to vote based on accurate and reliable information. So overall, the long-term effects, I think, are of more concern.
Yeah, we need to talk about those long-term effects. When I think of the worst-case scenario for election misinfo, the attack on the U.S. Capitol comes to mind, right? January 6, 2021, an angry mob barges into the Capitol building all because they thought the election was stolen. We know that's not true, and yet it didn't seem to matter. Heidi, I want to come back to you. I think it's easy to say, oh, that's a one-off. That's our wild neighbors to the south. But do we see anything, even on a smaller scale, that looks like that in Canada?
Well, I think we certainly see moments where demonstrations or other kind of activity has a broad range of motives, some of which are potentially fueled by mis or disinformation. But I think actually the most important thing that we get out of January 6th is that that wasn't something that just happened because of the election. It's the result of actually decades of creating information ecosystems that people exist in that mean that facts aren't penetrating through to them. And so even if they're given the accurate facts, it doesn't change their belief system. So scholars go back all the way to the 1980s with the growth of talk radio, and then, of course, the emergence of Fox News. So that, for me, is the biggest lesson, that January 6th doesn't come out of a vacuum. It comes out of decades of building an ecosystem that makes it possible.
Can I just jump in on that? I think one of the big illustrations of January 6th, to me, it hits at one of the misconceptions about misinformation, which is that misinformation is just the absence of fact. I think a lot of people think, well, if people believe an incorrect thing or something that's not true, we just need to give them the correct facts. But I mean, January 6th, it went to court. Police testified about the level of violence that day. I remember watching that live on TV, and I know I wasn't alone in that. And so there is so much evidence to support what actually happened that day, and yet none of that seems to matter. And so I think it's really important that we think about these things not just as some devoid of facts or devoid of information, but as a social problem. People believe that because it feels good to them, their friends are saying it, their community is validating them in that belief.
Alex, out west, I mean, in the BC provincial election, there was some rumblings about election denialism. Where were those coming from?
Yeah, we saw, again, not to the scale that we saw on January 6th, but we did see little pieces of that. So people were going online to question, the ways in which the ballots were being handled. They were questioning some of the voting systems that were used to count votes. We've seen a little bit even trickle up nationally. We've seen people this week start to question the fact that when you go to a poll, they get a pencil instead of a pen. And people have said, wow, is that, someone trying to change my vote? And so part of that, I think, speaks to how porous the border is. A lot of the information from the U.S. tends to slosh over the border, and it's something that, here in Canada we get as well. But I also think it speaks to kind of that social impact. People really live in silos online, and they think that, I think this way, so everyone must too. And so if the election isn't going the way I like it, or if, people are coming out and voting in ways that I don't think make sense, then it must be something wrong with the process.
Okay. I want to come back to James's point. This is the first federal election in Canada where you and I cannot see news on Facebook or Instagram. Why? Take a look.
Remember Bill C-18, the Online News Act? An attempt by the Liberal government to get big tech to pay news organizations for their work. But it backfired. And Meta, the biggest player in the Canadian social media landscape, simply blocked all news content from its platforms. News organizations have undoubtedly suffered, but what's more interesting is 3/4 of Canadians weren't even aware of this ban.
James, people don't even know there's a ban. So they're still, like you said, looking at Facebook and thinking they're getting news. So your reporting looks at who is filling that vacuum. Who's out there?
Yeah, this is a really unique experiment, if you like, that Meta is conducting with Canadian democracy, completely removing the news media from a platform that's relied on by millions of Canadians every day for news. So what are they getting in this federal election? So our reporting found that the posts about Mark Carney that were going hugely viral on Facebook, being viewed by hundreds of thousands of people, were almost exclusively from Canada Proud, which is a third-party advertising group whose stated aim is to defeat Mark Carney. Now, what's really interesting about Canada Proud is the way that the organization packages up news, slipping underneath Facebook's news ban, and it will do something like, say, take a news story from the CBC, spin it a little bit, source the CBC as the creator of that news story, and say, Mark Carney did X, Y, Z. What people don't realize is that technically they're seeing a piece of partisan content that's using the news media, which is banned on Facebook, to make a point about someone that they want to lose. Now, everywhere other than Canada, those posts by Canada Proud are part of a rich slurry of news, memes, Gen AI slop, all kinds of stuff. In Canada, they're the only thing that exists.
Wow.
So other than the official party pages, all you see on Facebook, if you're trying to find out what's happening in the federal election, is pretty much Canada Proud. It's an amazing success story, but also pretty alarming when you think about the quality and the diversity of the information ecosystem.
Right. And people may not know, right, what the background is there. They're just seeing this. And we actually debunked one of their stories on our reality check segment just a few weeks ago. So if you want to go check out Big If True TVO on YouTube, you can find that segment and see, you know, there's pieces of truth, not a lot of context necessarily, and it's important to have that context. James, I want to know, how do they get past that meta filter?
The filter's not perfect. So we took a look at how good Meta's filter was. It's based on a list that was created by Meta when the ban was put in place. And it turns out that list is updated fairly regularly. But Canada Proud isn't the only organization that slips under it. It seemingly slips under it, and Meta isn't great at responding to questions these days, but it seemingly slips under it by being a third-party advertiser, which is a kind of a strange designation, but that's what it is. But it's putting news on Facebook. There are other organizations that do similar. They'll do things like little videos about the best places to get Chinese food in Toronto, or the best cabana souks in and around Montreal.
Right.
But they'll also do stuff about, you know, issues that are important to people in the run-up to the federal election. But by far and away, and almost to the point of Canada Proud being the only page that does this in any scale and to any success. It's hugely dominant.
We have to all be aware of what we're taking in.